For years, the Linux desktop has been praised for its power, flexibility, and freedom. But at the same time, it has struggled with something much more subtle and much more important for everyday users: user experience. The Linux desktop world has always focused heavily on customization, technical control, and open-source philosophy. Yet the actual experience of using Linux on the desktop has often felt inconsistent, fragmented, and sometimes even confusing. And in 2026, something interesting is happening. The conversation around Linux desktop UX is changing dramatically because a number of design decisions, ecosystem conflicts, and technical shifts are quietly breaking the traditional Linux desktop experience as people have known it for years. To understand what is happening, we first need to understand what Linux desktop UX has traditionally been built on. For a long time, the Linux desktop revolved around a handful of major desktop environments. The most influential ones have been GNOME and KDE Plasma. These two projects represent very different philosophies about how users should interact with Linux. GNOME focuses on simplicity, minimalism, and a very opinionated workflow. KDE Plasma, on the other hand, focuses on flexibility, customization, and giving users control over every detail of their desktop environment. For years, this contrast was actually a strength of Linux. If you wanted a simple and focused experience, you could install a distribution like Ubuntu that used GNOME. If you wanted a highly customizable desktop, you could use KDE Plasma through distributions like KDE Neon or openSUSE. But in 2026, the differences between these ecosystems are starting to create deeper UX problems. The Linux desktop is no longer just about picking a desktop environment. It is now about choosing between different design systems, application toolkits, packaging technologies, and workflows. And these choices are creating friction for users who simply want a consistent desktop experience. One of the biggest issues breaking Linux desktop UX today is application inconsistency. On many Linux distributions, applications can be built using different toolkits, such as GTK or Qt. GNOME applications typically use GTK, while KDE applications use Qt. In theory, this is not a problem. Linux has always supported multiple toolkits. But in practice, the visual and behavioral differences between these applications can create a fragmented experience. A GTK application running on KDE Plasma might not perfectly match the system theme. A Qt application running on GNOME might behave differently from native GNOME apps. Font rendering, file dialogues, settings integration, and notifications can all behave slightly differently depending on the application framework being used. For experienced Linux users, these differences are normal and even expected. But for new users coming from Windows or Mac OS, this inconsistency can feel like something is broken. On those platforms, applications typically follow a unified design language and integrate tightly with the operating system. On Linux, the operating system itself is more of a collection of components than a single cohesive platform. And while this modularity is powerful, it can also weaken the overall user experience. Another major factor changing Linux desktop UX is the rise of new application packaging systems. Traditionally, Linux applications were installed through distribution repositories using package managers like apt or DNF. These repositories ensured that applications were built specifically for the distribution and integrated well with the system. But modern Linux development has moved toward universal packaging formats like Flatpak and Snap. These formats allow developers to distribute applications independently of the Linux distribution, which solves many compatibility problems. Flatpak, in particular, has become extremely popular across many distributions, including Fedora, Linux Mint, and even Ubuntu as an optional alternative to Snap. But while Flatpak solves the problem of software availability, it also introduces new UX challenges. Flatpak applications run inside sandbox environments, which means they require special permissions to access system resources such as files, cameras, or network devices. For new users, these permission systems can be confusing. Sometimes an application cannot access a folder or device because it has not been granted permission through a tool like Flatseal. The user may not understand why the application behaves differently from traditional system packages. Snap packages introduce their own set of UX problems. On Ubuntu, Snap has been integrated deeply into the system, and many core applications such as the Firefox browser are distributed as snaps. But Snap applications can sometimes launch more slowly than traditional packages, which creates the perception that Linux applications are sluggish. Even though Snap technology has improved over time, the reputation for slow startup times continues to affect user perception of the Linux desktop experience. Another issue breaking Linux desktop UX is the lack of consistency between Linux distributions. Linux distributions are one of the strengths of the Linux ecosystem, but they also create fragmentation. Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Arch Linux, and openSUSE all provide different default experiences. Even when two distributions use the same desktop environment, the details can be very different. Ubuntu modifies GNOME heavily to include its own dock theme and system settings. Fedora uses GNOME in a much more upstream form. Linux Mint uses the Cinnamon desktop environment, which was originally developed as a response to GNOME's design changes. For users switching between distributions, the differences can be confusing. Something as simple as system settings may be located in different places, depending on the distribution and desktop environment. Software management tools also vary widely. Ubuntu uses the Snap Store and the Ubuntu Software Center. Fedora uses GNOME software with Flatpak integration. Arch Linux users often rely on the command line and the Arch user repository. Each of these approaches works well within its own ecosystem, but the lack of standardization makes Linux feel less predictable than other operating systems. The design philosophy of GNOME itself has also become a major topic in discussions about Linux desktop UX. GNOME has moved toward a very minimal and streamlined interface. The traditional desktop with icons and taskbars has been replaced by an activities overview and dynamic workspaces. Many users appreciate this design because it reduces clutter and encourages keyboard-driven workflows. However, other users feel that GNOME removes too much control from the user. Features such as desktop icons, advanced configuration options, and certain interface behaviors are not available by default and require extensions to restore. Extensions are a powerful part of the GNOME ecosystem, but they also create UX challenges. GNOME extensions can modify almost every aspect of the desktop environment, but they are not always stable across GNOME updates. When a new version of GNOME is released, some extensions may stop working until they are updated by their developers. For users who rely heavily on extensions to customize their workflow, this can make the desktop feel unreliable. KDE Plasma approaches desktop UX very differently. KDE Plasma offers a massive amount of customization. Panels can be moved, widgets can be added, themes can be changed, and system behavior can be modified in countless ways. For power users, this flexibility is one of the greatest strengths of Linux, but for new users, KDE Plasma's vast configuration options can sometimes feel overwhelming. The System Settings application includes dozens of categories and hundreds of options, which can make it difficult to find specific settings. Interestingly, KDE Plasma has been making significant improvements in usability and performance in recent years. KDE Plasma 6 introduced a more refined interface, improved Wayland support, and better performance across many hardware configurations. Many Linux users now consider KDE Plasma one of the most polished desktop environments available. Yet even with these improvements, the broader Linux ecosystem still struggles with consistency. Another major factor transforming Linux desktop UX is the transition from X11 to Wayland. For decades, the X11 display server powered most Linux desktop environments. But X11 was designed in a very different era of computing, and it has many limitations related to security, performance, and modern graphics capabilities. Wayland was created as a replacement for X11, offering a more modern architecture for handling graphics and input. The transition to Wayland is one of the most significant changes in the history of the Linux desktop. Many distributions such as Fedora and Ubuntu now use Wayland by default for GNOME sessions. KDE Plasma also supports Wayland and continues to improve its implementation. Wayland provides better security and smoother graphics performance, especially on modern hardware. However, the transition to Wayland has also introduced compatibility challenges. Some applications and tools were originally designed specifically for X11 and do not work perfectly under Wayland. Screen recording software, remote desktop tools, and certain graphics utilities may require special compatibility layers or alternative solutions. While these issues are gradually being resolved, they still contribute to the perception that the Linux desktop experience is inconsistent. Hardware support is another area where Linux desktop UX is evolving rapidly. Historically, Linux sometimes struggled with certain hardware components, particularly Wi-Fi adapters, graphics cards, and touchpads. In recent years, hardware support has improved dramatically. Companies like AMD have embraced open-source drivers, and Intel continues to provide excellent Linux support. As a result, many modern laptops now run Linux extremely well. At the same time, certain hardware configurations can still create UX challenges. NVIDIA graphics cards, for example, rely on proprietary drivers that historically had limited compatibility with Wayland. While NVIDIA has made significant improvements in recent driver releases, the interaction between proprietary drivers and open-source desktop environments can still introduce complications. Laptop manufacturers are also starting to play a role in shaping Linux desktop UX. Companies like System76 and Framework are producing laptops specifically designed for Linux users. System76 develops its own distribution called Pop_OS, which includes a customized GNOME environment and unique features such as automatic GPU switching and advanced tiling window management. Framework laptops focus on modular design and repairability while maintaining strong Linux compatibility. These hardware initiatives are helping to create more polished Linux experiences, but they also highlight another challenge. The Linux desktop is evolving in multiple directions at once. Different companies and communities are experimenting with different design ideas, which means there is no single unified vision for the future of the Linux desktop. Another interesting development affecting Linux desktop UX is the growing popularity of immutable Linux distributions. Traditional Linux distributions allow users to modify system files and install software directly into the operating system. Immutable distributions take a different approach. In systems like Fedora Silverblue, the core operating system is read-only, and applications are installed through containerized environments such as Flatpak. Immutable systems offer several advantages. They are more resistant to system corruption, easier to update, and simpler to roll back if something goes wrong. But they also introduce a different workflow that may feel unfamiliar to traditional Linux users. Instead of installing packages directly into the system, users rely more heavily on containerized applications and development environments. For developers, this approach can be extremely powerful. Tools like Toolbox and Distrobox allow developers to create isolated environments for different programming languages or frameworks. But for everyday desktop users, the shift toward immutable systems may require new mental models for how software works on Linux. Despite all these challenges, the Linux desktop is also improving in many ways. Modern desktop environments are more visually polished than ever before. GNOME continues to refine its design language with improved animations, adaptive layouts, and better touchpad gestures. KDE Plasma is pushing the boundaries of customization and performance, while also simplifying many parts of its interface. Application developers are also beginning to pay more attention to Linux desktop UX. Projects like libadwaita aim to provide a consistent design framework for GNOME applications. KDE has its own design guidelines that help developers create applications that integrate smoothly with the Plasma desktop. These design systems are gradually improving the visual coherence of Linux applications. The Linux gaming ecosystem has also contributed to improving desktop UX. The release of the Steam Deck demonstrated that Linux can deliver a polished gaming experience when hardware and software are designed together. Valve's work on Proton has allowed thousands of Windows games to run on Linux with minimal configuration. Many of the improvements developed for the Steam Deck are now benefiting the broader Linux desktop ecosystem. In the end, what people often describe as breaking Linux desktop UX is actually part of a much larger transformation. The Linux desktop is evolving from a hobbyist platform into a mainstream computing environment used by developers, gamers, creators, and everyday users. This transition is messy, complex, and sometimes frustrating, but it is also driving innovation across the entire ecosystem. The Linux desktop may never look exactly like Windows or Mac OS, and that may actually be its greatest strength. Instead of a single rigid interface, Linux offers multiple approaches to computing. GNOME emphasizes focus and simplicity. KDE Plasma emphasizes flexibility and power. Distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Arch Linux, and openSUSE each bring their own perspectives to the desktop experience. The real challenge for the Linux community in 2026 is finding ways to improve consistency and usability without sacrificing the openness and diversity that make Linux unique. Projects like Flatpak, Wayland, and modern design frameworks are all attempts to solve pieces of this puzzle. Some of these changes will succeed, others will evolve, and a few may even disappear over time. But one thing is certain: the Linux desktop experience is changing faster now than at almost any other point in its history. The decisions being made today about design systems, application distribution, hardware integration, and system architecture will shape the future of Linux for the next decade. And whether these changes ultimately break the Linux desktop experience or finally unify it into something better will depend on how the Linux community navigates this moment of transformation.